The golden skyline of Dubai stretched endlessly before Sheikh Mustafa al-Rashid. From the terrace of his penthouse, the world below seemed insignificant. Miniature cars weaving through shimmering streets, yachts gliding across the Persian Gulf, and neon-lit towers piercing the twilight. This city was his kingdom, an empire built by generations of al-Rashid rulers. Yet tonight, everything was about to change. Mustafa turned away from the view and glanced at his reflection in the glass. His sharp jawline and dark eyes mirrored the confidence of a man who had never been denied anything. He was born into wealth, shaped by power, and destined for a future most could only dream of. But destiny, he was beginning to realize, was a fickle thing. Behind him, in the lavishly decorated room, sat his father, Sheikh Abdul al-Rashid, the patriarch of their lineage. His gaze, usually filled with pride, was now cold and unforgiving. To his right sat Mustafa's older brother, Omar, the heir to the family fortune, his expression dark with restrained fury. The elders of the family lined the room, their eyes heavy with silent judgment. In the center of it all, Mustafa stood tall, unwavering, his heart pounding with a mix of defiance and anticipation. "I have made my decision," he declared, his voice steady. "I will marry Layla." A deafening silence filled the room. The air grew thick with unspoken threats, with centuries of tradition pressing down upon him like an invisible weight. His father's grip tightened on the armrest of his chair. "You will do no such thing," he said, his voice as sharp as broken glass. "You are an al-Rashid. Your duty is to your family, to your bloodline." Mustafa clenched his fists. He had prepared for this, but nothing could have steeled him against the sheer force of his father's disapproval. "I love her," he said simply. "She is my choice." Omar's laughter broke the tension. It was low and bitter, the sound of amusement laced with disbelief. "Love," he scoffed. "You would throw away everything for a woman who does not understand our ways, for a foreigner who will never be accepted." "She is not just a foreigner," Mustafa countered, his voice rising. "She is intelligent, kind, and unlike anyone I have ever known. She challenges me to be better, to think beyond our name, beyond wealth and power." His father exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples as if Mustafa were an insolent child rather than a grown man. "You are blinded by foolish emotions," he said. "Marriage is not about love. It is about duty, alliances, strengthening the family." "I refuse to be a pawn in a political game," Mustafa shot back. Omar stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the marble floor. "Then you are no longer one of us." The words hit harder than any physical blow. Mustafa's chest tightened. He had anticipated resistance, but not this absolute severance, this complete erasure of his identity. His father's next words sealed his fate. "If you leave this family for her, you leave behind your name, your title, your fortune. You will have nothing." Nothing. The weight of the moment settled upon Mustafa, but his resolve did not waver. He had always known this was a possibility. And yet, for the first time in his life, he felt free. He straightened his spine, his voice calm when he spoke. "Then I will leave with nothing." A final silence followed, one that carried centuries of tradition crashing down upon him. His father did not look at him as he turned away. Omar's expression was unreadable, but there was a glint of something dark in his eyes, something that warned Mustafa that this battle was far from over. As he walked toward the door, he felt the weight of history pressing against his back. He was leaving behind more than just wealth. He was abandoning a legacy, a name that had shaped him since birth. But in the depths of his soul, he knew he was walking toward something greater. The roar of jet engines filled Mustafa's ears as the private plane lifted off the tarmac, carrying him away from the only life he had ever known. Through the small window, he watched the glowing skyline of Dubai shrink in the distance, its golden towers disappearing beneath the clouds. A part of him had expected to feel regret, to be haunted by the weight of his decision, but all he felt was the warmth of Layla's hand wrapped around his. She sat beside him, her hazel eyes searching his face for any sign of doubt. "Are you sure about this?" she asked softly. Mustafa turned to her, taking in the familiar features he had come to love, the soft waves of her dark hair, the gentle curve of her lips, the quiet strength in her gaze. He had given up a kingdom for this woman, and yet, in this moment, looking at her, he knew he had made the right choice. "I have never been more sure of anything," he murmured. Layla exhaled, relief flickering across her face. She squeezed his hand, then glanced around the cabin. The plane, though luxurious, no longer belonged to him. A favor from an old friend had secured them this one-way flight to Europe, but once they landed, they would be truly on their own. For the first time in his life, Mustafa had no wealth, no status, no protection, and reality was beginning to set in. Their new life began in the narrow streets of Istanbul, where the scent of roasting chestnuts and spiced tea filled the air. The city was a world away from Dubai's glass and steel skyline. Here, ancient mosques stood alongside bustling bazaars, and history whispered from every cobblestone. Mustafa and Layla rented a small apartment near the Bosphorus, its walls bare, its furniture old and worn. The simplicity of it was humbling. He had once lived in a palace with servants at his beck and call. Now he found himself struggling to light the ancient gas stove. Layla laughed as she watched him, stepping forward to help. "You might have to get used to this," she teased. Mustafa chuckled, shaking his head. "I never thought cooking would be part of my destiny." Despite the humor, there was an underlying tension neither of them spoke of. Mustafa had left behind billions. Now, they were living off what little savings Layla had, and even that wouldn't last long. "I need to find work," he said one evening as they sat on the small balcony, watching the ferries glide across the water. Layla hesitated before replying. "Have you thought about reaching out to someone? An old friend, maybe?" Mustafa's jaw tightened. He knew what she meant. There were powerful people who owed him favors, business moguls, politicians, old allies from his father's world. One phone call, and he could be back in the game, but it would mean swallowing his pride. "I won't beg for scraps from the people who turned their backs on me," he said. Layla studied him carefully. "It's not begging, Mustafa. It's survival." He didn't answer. Instead, he turned his gaze toward the sea, where the horizon stretched infinitely before him. He had made his choice, and now he would live with it, no matter how difficult the road ahead became. Days turned to weeks. Mustafa searched for work, but his name, once revered, now meant nothing. He was no longer the son of a powerful sheikh. He was just another man in a city where no one cared about his past. Rejection after rejection weighed on him. At night, Layla would hold his hand, whispering that they would find a way, but he could see the worry in her eyes. The money was running out. One evening, as they walked through the Grand Bazaar, a hooded figure stepped into Mustafa's path. The man's eyes were sharp, his presence oddly familiar. "Sheikh Mustafa al-Rashid," the man murmured, "you have fallen far." Mustafa tensed. His past had found him, and deep down, he knew this exile was only the beginning. Mustafa's muscles tensed as he locked eyes with the hooded man. The Grand Bazaar bustled around them. Merchants haggled, tourists browsed colorful stalls, the scent of saffron and roasted nuts filled the air. But in that moment, the world narrowed to just the two of them. The stranger's face was half hidden beneath his hood, but Mustafa could see the sharpness of his gaze, the way he carried himself, like a man accustomed to walking in the shadows. "I don't know you," Mustafa said cautiously. "But I know you." The man's voice was calm, his accent indistinct, as though he had traveled too many lands to belong to any single one. "And I know what you seek." Mustafa frowned. "And what is that?" The man's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. "Answers?" A flicker of unease passed through Mustafa. He had spent weeks struggling to survive, buried beneath the weight of his choices. Now, a stranger appeared, speaking as if he knew the secrets of his very soul. Layla stepped closer, her fingers grazing Mustafa's arm in silent warning. "Who are you?" she asked. The man hesitated, as if deciding how much to reveal. Then he inclined his head. "I'm called Yusuf, and I'm here because of a prophecy." Mustafa exhaled sharply. "Not this again. The old tales are meaningless," he said, shaking his head. "Stories created to keep children entertained." Yusuf's expression didn't change. "Are they?" He glanced at Layla. "Tell me, Miss Carter, what does your expertise say about ancient prophecies?" Layla stiffened. Though she rarely spoke of it, she was an archaeologist specializing in Middle Eastern civilizations. Her work had led her to uncover long-forgotten texts, hidden messages buried in time, and yet even she seemed reluctant to entertain the idea. "Most prophecies are myth," she admitted, "but sometimes myths are built on truth." Mustafa sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Enough of this. If you know who I am, then you also know I have no time for riddles. My family has turned its back on me. I have nothing." Yusuf's eyes gleamed. "Not nothing," he said. "You still have your bloodline." Mustafa frowned. Yusuf leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Do you truly believe the Al-Rashid name is only about wealth and power? Your lineage is older than Dubai itself. There are things your family has long buried, secrets you were never meant to uncover." A strange chill ran down Mustafa's spine. Layla shifted beside him. "What kind of secrets?" Yusuf gestured toward a nearby alley. "Walk with me, and I will show you." Mustafa hesitated. Every instinct told him this was foolish. But something about Yusuf's presence, his certainty, made it impossible to ignore. He nodded once. "Lead the way." The alley was quiet, tucked between the ancient stone walls of the marketplace. Yusuf led them through winding paths until they reached a small, dimly lit shop nestled between two larger buildings. The scent of aged paper and incense filled the air as they stepped inside. The shop was cluttered with books, scrolls and artifacts, some covered in dust, others carefully preserved under glass. Yusuf moved toward a wooden chest in the corner, unlocking it with a rusted key. He pulled out an old parchment, its edges frayed with time, and placed it carefully on the table. "This," he said, "is what your family has hidden for generations." Mustafa peered down at the parchment. The ink was faded, the script ancient Arabic, but the words, what little he could make out, sent a shiver through him. "From the blood of the exiled shall rise the one who sees beyond the golden mirage, destined not to rule, but to awaken." He exhaled sharply. "What is this?" "A prophecy," Yusuf said simply, "and I believe it speaks of you." Mustafa shook his head. "This is nonsense." "Is it?" Yusuf asked. "Your exile, your fall from grace, these things were not coincidences. They were necessary steps toward something greater." Layla frowned, studying the parchment. "This mentions the exiled. That could refer to anyone." Yusuf nodded. "Perhaps, but the Al-Rashid family has always been obsessed with control, controlling their wealth, their legacy, their very bloodline. Why do you think they cast you out so easily?" Mustafa's throat tightened. "Because I betrayed them, or because they feared you?" Yusuf countered. Silence fell over the room. Layla was the first to speak. "What exactly are you saying?" Yusuf leaned forward. "I am saying that Mustafa's exile was not a punishment. It was a safeguard. The Al-Rashid elders have known of this prophecy for centuries. They feared what would happen if it ever came true." Mustafa's pulse pounded in his ears. He wanted to dismiss this as madness, but a part of him, buried deep beneath his skepticism, felt something stir, a sense of inevitability. "What happens if the prophecy is real?" he asked quietly. Yusuf smiled. "Then your story is only just beginning." Mustafa lay awake that night, staring at the cracked ceiling of their small apartment. Layla slept beside him, her breathing slow and steady, but his mind refused to rest. Yusef's words echoed in his thoughts, each syllable carving deeper into his certainty. Your exile was not a punishment, it was a safeguard. He had dismissed the prophecy as nonsense, but deep down, something unsettled him. His family had always been ruthless, but were they truly afraid of him, afraid of what he might become? The idea gnawed at him like a wound, refusing to close. Slipping out of bed carefully, he moved to the balcony, where the city of Istanbul stretched before him in golden lamplight. He had traded a kingdom of skyscrapers for this, narrow streets, ancient stones, a life lived humbly, and yet he felt no regret, only questions. Behind him, Layla stirred. "Can't sleep," she murmured, stepping into the cool night air. Mustafa exhaled. "Too much on my mind." She leaned against the railing beside him. "Is it Yusef?" A humorless chuckle escaped him. "Is it ever not Yusef?" Layla hesitated before saying, "I don't know if I believe in prophecies, but I do believe in history, and history is written by those in power." She met his gaze. "If your family erased something, it was for a reason." Mustafa frowned. He had spent his entire life believing he knew everything about the Al-Rashid name. Now, doubt was creeping in like an unwelcome guest. A knock on the door cut through the silence. Layla tensed. At this hour, Mustafa moved swiftly, his instincts honed from a lifetime of privilege where threats had always lingered in the shadows. He approached the door and peered through the peephole. No one. Frowning, he opened it cautiously. A sharp gust of wind greeted him. On the ground lay a single envelope. He bent down, fingers brushing the coarse paper. There was no name, no insignia, just a wax seal, dark red like dried blood. Layla stepped closer. "What is it?" Mustafa broke the seal and unfolded the note. The handwriting was precise, almost clinical. "You should not have met with Yusef. Some things are meant to remain buried. Leave Istanbul, or you will not leave at all." A cold dread settled in his chest. Someone was watching him. The next morning, Mustafa took the letter to Yusef. The old scholar studied it carefully, his expression unreadable. "This is not a threat," Yusef finally said. "It is a warning." Mustafa crossed his arms. "And what exactly am I being warned about?" Yusef placed the letter down. "There are those who benefit from keeping the past hidden. If they know you are asking questions, then you are already a danger to them." Layla scoffed. "A danger? Mustafa has no power anymore." Yusef's gaze sharpened. "Does he?" Mustafa stiffened. Yusef leaned forward. "You may no longer be a sheikh, but you are still an Al-Rashid. That alone makes you dangerous. You were meant to inherit an empire, but perhaps your fate is much greater than that." Mustafa shook his head. "I have no desire for power." "Perhaps not," Yusef said, "but power has a way of finding those who are meant to wield it." Layla rubbed her temples. "So what do we do?" "Whoever left that note clearly wants us gone." Yusef considered this. "If they want you gone, it means you are getting close to something." Mustafa clenched his jaw. He was tired of being manipulated by his family, by fate, by people who spoke in riddles. He needed answers. "How do we fight an enemy we can't even see?" he asked. Yusef's eyes darkened. "We stop running, we make them show themselves." Layla stared at them both. "And how exactly do we do that?" Yusef smiled grimly. "By seeking the one thing they fear most, the truth." The Grand Bazaar was alive with movement. Traders haggled, spices perfumed the air, and merchants displayed shimmering fabrics under golden lanterns. But Mustafa had no time to admire the beauty of Istanbul's heart. He, Layla, and Yusef moved quickly through the maze of stalls, slipping deeper into the hidden corners of the ancient market. Yusef led them into a dimly lit bookstore, tucked between two weathered buildings. The scent of parchment and ink filled the space, dust particles dancing in the slanted sunlight. An elderly bookseller peered at them over the rim of his glasses, barely acknowledging their presence. Yusuf strode to the counter and placed a folded note before the man. The bookseller's gaze flickered downward, recognition flashing in his eyes. Without a word, he locked the door behind them and pulled a heavy curtain across the front window. Mustafa exchanged a glance with Layla. This was no ordinary bookstore. The bookseller gestured toward the back of the shop. "Follow me!" He led them down a narrow staircase, deeper underground, until they entered a chamber filled with relics and scrolls. The walls were lined with shelves stacked with texts in languages long forgotten. In the center of the room stood a wooden table, and on it a single parchment lay unrolled. "This is what you seek," the bookseller murmured. Mustafa stepped forward, his pulse quickening. The parchment was old, older than anything he had ever seen. The ink had faded, but the symbols were unmistakable. Layla inhaled sharply. This is Aramaic," she whispered, tracing her fingers lightly over the text. "One of the oldest written languages in the world," Yusuf nodded. "And it speaks of your bloodline, Mustafa." Mustafa's throat tightened. He scanned the parchment, unable to read the ancient script, but sensing its weight nonetheless. Layla began to translate. "From the house of the sun shall come the exiled one, destined to awaken the past and restore what was lost. The guardians of the old world shall rise against him, but through the sands of the forgotten, he will find his path." A chill ran down Mustafa's spine. Yusuf folded his arms. "Your family has erased many things, Mustafa. But history does not forget so easily." Mustafa swallowed hard. "What does this mean?" Layla met his gaze. "It means that your exile was not random. It was written long before you were even born." Silence filled the chamber. Mustafa clenched his jaw. He had spent his entire life believing his family was built on wealth and power. But now, standing in this hidden place, facing a prophecy written in a language older than Dubai itself, he realized his past was only the beginning, and something far greater was waiting for him to uncover. The sun hung low in the sky, bleeding shades of crimson and gold across the endless expanse of the Arabian desert. The wind carried grains of sand across the dunes, whispering secrets lost to time. Mustafa stood at the edge of civilization, staring into the vast emptiness ahead. Behind him, the city of Istanbul was already a distant memory. Before him lay the unknown. Yusuf adjusted the straps of his pack and turned to him. "This is where the past and future collide, Mustafa. If you seek the truth, you must be willing to walk where no one dares." Layla, standing beside Mustafa, shielded her eyes from the sun. "I still don't understand why the answers have to be out here," she muttered. "If your family buried the past, why not in a vault somewhere in Dubai? Why the desert?" Mustafa exhaled. "Because some things are too powerful to be locked away." Yusuf nodded approvingly. "And because the desert does not forget." They mounted their camels and began the journey. The desert stretched infinitely before them, a golden sea of shifting dunes. Hours passed in silence, the rhythmic sway of their camels, the only constant in a world untouched by time. Mustafa's thoughts drifted as the journey wore on. He had spent years believing his legacy was tied to wealth, to boardrooms and skyscrapers. But now, he was beginning to see his family's power had roots far deeper than oil and trade. By nightfall, they made camp beneath a canopy of stars. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows across the sand. Yusuf sat cross-legged, studying an old map spread before him. According to the manuscript, the temple should be another day's journey from here. Mustafa traced the faded lines on the parchment. "And you believe whatever my family was hiding is inside?" Yusuf looked up. "I don't believe in Mustafa, I know." Layla shifted uncomfortably. "I still don't like this. Someone sent that warning in Istanbul for a reason. If we're getting close, it means we're not the only ones looking." Mustafa met her gaze. "I know, and that's exactly why we have to keep going." She sighed, running a hand through her hair. I just hope we're ready for whatever we find." Mustafa glanced out at the dunes, his mind heavy with the weight of destiny. Something was waiting for him in the heart of the desert, and tomorrow he would finally face it. The sun burned high above as Mustafa, Layla and Yusuf pressed forward, their camels trudging through the shifting sands. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, but Yusuf moved with certainty, his eyes locked onto the horizon. By midday, the wind carried something different, a whisper, faint yet persistent, curling through the dunes like a voice calling from another time. Then, as they crested a particularly steep ridge, Mustafa saw it. Nestled between two towering cliffs lay the ruins of an ancient temple, half buried beneath centuries of sand. Massive stone pillars jutted out like skeletal remains, their surfaces etched with intricate carvings. The entrance was a yawning abyss, its darkness untouched by the relentless sun. Layla dismounted first, brushing her fingers over one of the carvings. "This is older than anything I've ever studied," she murmured. "This isn't just forgotten history. This was erased." Mustafa approached cautiously, his heart pounding. He had spent his life surrounded by wealth, yet standing before this temple, he had never felt so small. Yusuf placed a hand on his shoulder. "This is where your true test begins." Mustafa frowned. "Test?" Yusuf nodded toward the entrance. "The prophecy speaks of a trial, one that only the rightful heir can overcome." Layla shot him a worried glance. "And what happens if he fails?" Yusuf was silent. Mustafa exhaled, then stepped forward. "Then I suppose we find out." The air inside the temple was thick, untouched for centuries. Mustafa led the way, their torchlight casting eerie shadows across the stone walls. Hieroglyphs stretched along the passageway, telling a story Mustafa could not yet understand. Then they reached the inner chamber. At its center stood a pedestal, upon which rested an ornate golden dagger. The moment Mustafa stepped inside, the room trembled, as if the temple itself had awakened. A deep voice echoed through the chamber, though there was no visible source. "The exile has returned, but is he worthy?" Mustafa stiffened. "Who's there?" The voice ignored him. "3 trials await. The first, the weight of the past." Suddenly, the walls flickered, visions appearing like ghosts. Mustafa saw himself as a child, standing before his father. He saw the cold disappointment in the old man's eyes, the pressure to be perfect, to obey. Then the scene changed, his exile, the moment he chose love over power, the look of betrayal on Omar's face. The voice rumbled again. "Do you regret your choice?" Mustafa's chest tightened. The past clawed at him, whispering doubts, but he clenched his fists. "No." His voice was steady. "I do not." The visions faded. Yusuf exhaled in relief. "You passed the first trial." Layla touched his arm. "But what comes next?" The temple trembled again. "The second trial begins." Mustafa steadied himself. Whatever lay ahead, he would face it, because this was no longer just about a prophecy. It was about uncovering the truth his family had tried so hard to bury. The chamber trembled as the second trial began. Mustafa stood firm, his breath steady, waiting for whatever came next. The disembodied voice returned, its tone deep and ancient. The second trial, the strength of the present. Before Mustafa could react, the room shifted. The torches flickered violently, and the stone beneath his feet felt as though it was crumbling away. Suddenly, figures emerged from the darkness, shadows taking form. At first, they were faceless, but then, one by one, they became people he knew. Layla, Yusuf, his brother Omar, even his father. The figures stood in a circle around him, their gazes sharp, unreadable. Then the voice echoed again. "You have chosen exile. You have chosen love, but will you choose power when the time comes, or will you betray your fate?" A sword materialized at Mustafa's feet, its blade gleaming under the dim light. "Prove your strength. Cut down those who stand in your way." Mustafa tensed. He turned to Layla's figure. Her eyes, though ghostly, held something familiar. "Trust." He shook his head. "No, The voice rumbled, "They will betray you. They will take what is yours. Strike first or be destroyed." The shadow of Omar stepped forward. Mustafa felt the old resentment, the bitter rivalry that had simmered for years. Omar had cast him out, humiliated him, took everything from him. And yet, Mustafa clenched his fists. "I will not be my brother," he said firmly. "I will not be the kind of man who rules through fear." The figures began to dissolve. The voice spoke one last time. "You have passed the second trial." Then the darkness faded. The chamber returned to normal, the visions gone. Youssef and Layla were at his side again, real and solid. Layla exhaled. What just happened? Youssef nodded approvingly. He was tested, and he did not break. Mustafa turned back toward the pedestal. The golden dagger was still there, untouched, but something felt different now. The air was heavier. And then, before he could speak, the doors of the temple slammed shut. A slow clap echoed through the chamber. Mustafa spun around, and his blood turned cold. Standing in the entrance, flanked by armed men, was Rashid Khan, a former ally, a trusted friend, and now a betrayer. Rashid smirked. "You never should have come here, Mustafa." Layla tensed. "What are you doing?" Rashid sighed dramatically. "What I must. Your little adventure ends here." The guards raised their weapons. Mustafa's mind raced. He had survived the trials of the temple, but now he faced a far deadlier threat, and this time it was no test. This was real, and betrayal had come to claim its price. Mustafa's pulse pounded as Rashid Khan stepped forward, the smirk never leaving his face. The temple walls seemed to close in, ancient stone turning into a prison. "I should have known you'd betray me," Mustafa said, his voice steady despite the anger boiling within him. Rashid chuckled. "Betrayal? No, my friend. This is survival." He gestured toward the armed men at his side. "The Al-Rashid family does not tolerate loose ends. Your brother wants you erased." Layla's fingers tightened around Mustafa's wrist. "We have to get out of here." Mustafa's mind raced. He had fought against fate, against the expectations of his family, against the weight of history itself. Now he had to fight for his life. His gaze flickered to the golden dagger still resting on the pedestal. A weapon, a symbol, a choice. Before Rashid could issue a command, Mustafa lunged, his fingers curling around the dagger's hilt. The moment he touched it, the chamber trembled. A deep rumble echoed through the air, shaking the walls, sending dust and debris cascading from above. Rashid hesitated. What the hell is happening? Mustafa felt a strange energy surge through him, as if the weight of the past, the trials, the prophecy, the truth had fused with him in that instant. Then chaos erupted. Youssef moved first, knocking over a brazier, sending fire spilling across the stone floor. The flames roared to life, forcing Rashid's men to stagger back. Layla grabbed Mustafa's hand. "Run!" They raced toward the temple's side passage just as the ceiling began to crack. The structure was collapsing, the weight of centuries coming down like judgment. Behind them, Rashid shouted orders, but Mustafa didn't look back. He could hear the struggle, the clash of weapons, the cries of men caught in the chaos, but none of it mattered. Mattered was getting out alive. They burst into the open desert just as the temple caved in behind them, a massive cloud of dust rising into the air. Mustafa turned, chest heaving. The entrance was gone. Sealed by fate itself, Layla clutched his arm. Did Rashid? Mustafa exhaled. He made his choice. Silence settled over them, the desert wind their only companion. Then Youssef spoke. "You have passed the final trial." Mustafa looked down at the dagger in his hand. It was no longer just an artifact. It was a key, a symbol of who he had become. And for the first time, he understood. This was never about reclaiming his family's power. It was about becoming something greater. The prophecy was fulfilled, and his destiny was only just beginning. The desert stretched endlessly before them, golden dunes rolling like waves beneath the blazing sun. The ancient temple had collapsed into the sands, taking its secrets and Rashid Khan with it. Mustafa stood in silence, the weight of everything that had happened settling over him like a heavy cloak. He had lost his kingdom, been cast into exile, and walked the path of an outcast. But now, standing here, he realized he had found something far greater than power or wealth. He had found his truth. Layla placed a hand on his arm, her gaze searching his. What happens now? Mustafa looked down at the golden dagger still clutched in his hand. The metal felt warm, alive, as if the knowledge of centuries pulsed through it. "We can't go back to Istanbul," Yusuf said. "Your brother will not stop hunting you." Mustafa nodded. Omar had feared him before, but now he had every reason to see Mustafa as a threat. "I don't need to go back," Mustafa said. "Dubai no longer defines me." Layla hesitated. "Then what do we do?" Mustafa turned to Yusuf. The prophecy spoke of awakening something lost. That temple was only the beginning. There's more out there, secrets buried in time, truths erased by those in power. Yusuf studied him carefully. "And you mean to uncover them?" Mustafa met his gaze. "If my family spent centuries burying the past, it's time someone unearthed it." Layla exhaled. "So we don't stop here?" Mustafa shook his head. "No, we begin here." The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the desert. Mustafa was no longer a prince of Dubai, no longer a fallen heir clinging to the past. He was something else now, a seeker of truth, a man with a purpose greater than any throne. And this was only the beginning. The desert night was calm, the sky painted with 1,000,000 stars stretching infinitely above them. A soft breeze whispered through the dunes, carrying the scent of sand and time itself. Mustafa, Layla, and Yusuf sat around a small fire, its golden glow casting flickering shadows across their faces. They had survived. They had uncovered secrets meant to stay buried, and yet something told Mustafa their journey was far from over. Layla leaned back, gazing at the sky. "You know, if someone told me a year ago that I'd be sitting in the middle of the Arabian desert with an exiled sheikh and a mysterious scholar after escaping a collapsing temple, I would have laughed." Yusuf smirked. "And yet here you are," she exhaled, looking at Mustafa. "And here you are, not as the man they tried to force you to be, but as the man you were meant to become." Mustafa studied the golden dagger resting beside him. It was more than just a relic. It was proof that history had been altered, that power had been hidden in the shadows for centuries. And now he held the key to bringing it into the light. Yusuf poked at the fire with a stick. "The prophecy has been fulfilled, but that does not mean the battle is over." Mustafa nodded. "Omar will come for me, and if he knows what we found, he will come for both of you too." Layla frowned. "Then what do we do?" Mustafa straightened. "We stay ahead of him. We keep searching." He looked at Yusuf. "You said my family erased parts of history. If this prophecy was hidden, what else have they buried?" Yusuf's eyes gleamed. "More than you can imagine." Layla shook her head in disbelief. "So, what? We become fugitives, treasure hunters?" Mustafa's lips curled into the faintest smile. "No. We become something greater." Layla sighed, but there was a spark in her eyes, an excitement she couldn't hide. The fire crackled between them. A new path had been forged, one no longer bound by a throne, a title, or the chains of tradition. Mustafa was no longer a fallen prince. He was something else, a seeker, a liberator, a man on a mission. And as the first light of dawn painted the horizon, he knew this was just the beginning.